sesh on price elasticity of demand. Firstly, we're going to go through how it works, what the formula is, and at the end of this video, we're going to look at the usefulness of price elasticity of demand, influences on price elasticity of demand, and any problems, any issues with price elasticity of demand. But before we start price elasticity of demand, we need to think about the law of demand. The law of demand underpins it all. The law of demand is quite simply, if the price of a product increases, the demand will fall. Or if the price of a product falls, the demand will increase. If something is cheaper, the demand will increase. So clearly, the law of demand suggests there is a negative correlation between price and demand. And that is why, as we'll see later on, price elasticity of demand is always going to be a negative number because of the law of demand. Now, price elasticity of demand, or PED. PED is simply an extension of the law of demand, and it measures the responsiveness, the sensitivity, the responsiveness of demand to changes in price. So you change your price, you increase your price, for example. We know if you increase your price, we're going to get the opposite happen to demand because of the law of demand. But you've increased your price, elasticity, PED, is looking at how much will that demand fall? How much will it fall? And likewise, if it wasn't that you increase your price, if you decide to reduce your prices, we know demand will increase, but by how much will it increase? That is what PED, price elasticity of demand, is measuring. Now let's look at the formula. So PED formula is percentage change in quantity demanded, percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. Easy formula to remember, but the tricky thing is which way do you get it round? Is it the Q or the P? And just think QPR, Queen's Park Rangers. Q is always on top, QPR. Now let's go through two examples of using this formula. Example number one. So a business reduces its prices by 10%. Business reduces its prices by 10%. The result of that is the quantity demanded will increase by 40%. So they've dropped their prices by 10%. Quantity demanded has gone up by 40%. So if we throw the numbers into the formula, on the top is the quantity demanded. It went up by 40%, so plus 40%. And prices went down by 10%, so minus 10%. So the PED plus 40 divided by minus 10% equals minus 4. Just minus 4, no units. Minus 4 is the coefficient. That is the elasticity coefficient. That is what PED is. So if you have a PED of something like minus 4, then that suggests that the number is elastic. And the reason why it's elastic is quite simply because the percentage change in quantity demanded is bigger than the percentage change in the price change, because 40 is bigger than 10. So if you get that, clearly your number is going to be a number that, we take away negatives for the moment, a number that is greater than 1, then that would suggest you have an elastic price elasticity of demand. And essentially what it's saying is that you change your prices, in this case by 10%, well, demand is incredibly sensitive to that price change because demand has increased by fourfold of that. You've had an increase of 4 times the percentage that you dropped those prices by. So if you are elastic, your product is elastic, or your business is elastic in terms of its services, then that would suggest that your customers are sensitive to price changes. Now, the opposite of elastic is inelastic. Let's take a look at an example. So example number 2 is that prices have increased by 20%. Price is up by 20%, but the quantity demanded has only fallen by 4%. So you've chucked your prices up 20%, quantity demanded has only fallen by 4%. Clearly that's where a business really wants to be, have inelastic price elasticity of demand. And in this case, we chuck the numbers in, we put the QD on top, so it fell by 4%, so minus 4%, and we divide that by the price increase, which was plus 20%. Minus 4 divided by plus 20 is minus 0.2, a number, taking away the minus for the moment, a number that is less than 1. So we've got minus 2 there, that's minus 0.2 there. That's an example of an inelastic number. The reason why it's an inelastic price elasticity of demand is because you have the quantity demanded is smaller than the price change. So when changes in quantity demanded is smaller than the change in price. Clearly that suggests that demand is not very sensitive to price changes, and as I said before, that's clearly where a business would like to be. They would like to have PD that's particularly inelastic. Now, there is a strong relationship between PD and revenue. PD and revenue. The reason why is because revenue in its simplest form is just price times by sales. Price times by sales. Sales is effectively demand, which basically means the two things within your price elasticity or your law of demand are essentially the core components of revenue. So you will often talk about price elasticity, demand and revenue together, particularly in those longer questions where you might want to extend your chains of analysis. Just a word of warning, don't get confused with the fact that PD is to do with revenue and you start talking about profit, because profit's something different. That includes costs too. Just keep your PD in line with revenue. This is what you really need to know. If you have an elastic PD, and you increase your prices, well then revenue will fall. So if you have an elastic price, elastic demand, you increase your prices, revenue will fall. And if you reduce your prices, revenue will increase. So clearly, what is happening here is the change in prices, well, the opposite is happening to revenue. So what you do when you have an elastic price, elastic demand, what you do to prices, the opposite will happen to revenue. Increase prices, revenue will fall. Reduce prices, revenue will increase. Now that is different to if you have an inelastic price elastic demand. If you have an inelastic price elastic demand, if you increase your prices, revenue will increase. And if you reduce your prices, revenue will reduce. Now clearly that's brilliant. If you can increase your prices, revenue will increase. That shows where you want to be. That's the perfect scenario for a business from a revenue perspective. So clearly in the case of inelastic price elastic demand, the same impact will happen to revenue. So whatever you do to prices, if you have inelastic price elastic demand, the same thing will happen to revenue. A way I've always remembered that is elastic opposite, inelastic same. And I've always remembered it as IS, inelastic same, is. Now let's test that. So let's just say we have an elastic PD, and we increase our prices. So we increase our prices, the opposite of up is down because elastic opposite, so it means revenues will go down if we're to increase our prices if we have an elastic PD, if managers know they have an elastic PD. So clearly managers would not want to do that in that scenario because it's going to lead to lower revenues, which is why it's important for managers to use it. And that's what we're going to get into next when we look at the usefulness of PD, the influences of PD and any issues with PD. Let's move on. Now the next thing to look at is why price elasticity of demand is useful. Well, if a manager or a business is able to predict what their price elasticity of demand is, it gives them an edge because it means that if they decide to change their prices, maybe they increase their prices, maybe they drop their prices, well then they can see the likely impact on quantity demanded. And when we think about quantity demanded, it's just essentially sales. So if you can know your PD, you make your price change, and therefore you can predict the impact on those sales, well that means you can therefore get your staffing ready. Maybe you think your quantity demanded is going to increase. You forecast it's going to increase. Maybe it's because managers think they have an elastic PED, they've dropped prices, they think that quantity demanded is going to go through the roof. Well, that means you want to get your staffing in place. Maybe you need more staffing now. Also, you get your stock control in place. Maybe you need to up the amount of stocks you have. And that's going to make your cash flow forecasts and your income statement forecasts, your projections for the future, likely to be more precise and more accurate than they otherwise would have been if you did not know your PED. Also, if you're an international business, you are selling abroad, you are selling exports. Well, then you're subject to exchange rates, of course. Now, let's just do a simple example. The pound has increased in value, it's got stronger. You are a UK business that exports. So strong pound, imports cheap, exports dear. Exports dear, well, that means the price of your product in the country you're selling to has increased. So therefore, you might want to now consider the elasticity, because if your product is elastic, the revenues will fall. If your product is inelastic, the revenues will rise in that particular country. The next thing to think about is the business will want to be more price inelastic. The business will want to be more price inelastic. Why? Because if you increase your prices, your revenues will increase. How do you establish this? One, brand loyalty. If you can establish brand loyalty, maybe for a particular marketing strategy over time, that will make you less sensitive to price changes, price increases. Number 2 is the fewer rivals you have, the better for you, because customers have nowhere else to purchase the product from. In the ideal scenario, you are a monopoly. Number 3 is if your product is extremely cheap compared to the proportional average consumer's income, well, that will likely make you more inelastic. If a penny sweet became 2 pennies, how much difference would it have on quantity demanded proportionally compared to that 100% price increase? And number 4 is someone else is paying for it. This might be a scenario in the case of a business-to-business transaction where someone is acting on behalf of the business that is not the owner of the business and maybe is less bothered about it simply. Number 5 is if you don't have much time to consider, you are forced to be more price elastic. If you have all the time in the world to consider a decision, then you become more sensitive to price and therefore more price elastic. So a consideration, maybe sales promotion, so you can loop into that. If you can only buy it in a certain amount of time, does that up the inelasticity? Other issues to think about with price elasticity of demand, well, it's very difficult to calculate. The reason why is because there's lots of external factors always ruining the data really, because it might be that you think you've estimated it, but essentially when you were doing that data, changes were happening to incomes, the economy changed, maybe it's a recession, maybe it's a boom, maybe the weather was changing. So really it's extremely difficult to calculate PED, but if you can have an approx estimate, that will clearly aid managers as we saw with these components earlier on. I hope that helps with PED and I'll see you at the next sesh.